be the grouping of the darks. It's time for the next stage. And the next stage is the grouping of the darks. So what do we mean by grouping of the darks? We mean that we're taking all the dark things in the picture and giving them their correct values in the dark and the light, the shadow and the light, I mean. So I think it's obvious that we, tone the figures' shadows to a darker tone, but also we're gonna tone in darker objects like the hair of this model, for example. We're gonna tone it very dark as well. And we're actually gonna tone it pretty much the same value as the shadows on the figure. And the hair in shadow is gonna go even darker than that. So there is a little bit of a difference there. The hair in shadow in places goes pretty much just as dark as we can get with the graphite. So we take each object, if we had a dark object in this image, a pedestal or a dark box as you saw in those some of the pictures in the figure fundamentals video, we would be toning those in at this stage, and those objects we divide into the light and shadow. So for this hair we give the same value as the figure in shadow, the hair in light that is, and the hair in shadow is gonna be even darker still. So perhaps we will be toning as far as a value 8 on the scale, just next to the very darkest dark, this hair in shadow, and figure in shadow, hair in light can be pretty much one value step lighter. There doesn't need to be a great amount of contrast. And if you're wondering, maybe we're going too dark with this hair, it's a reddish brown. It's actually a pretty dark color on its own, and we don't really concern ourselves with the highlights. We can see maybe around this area on the model. Those will be coming in later, so we're just kind of doing the average tone at this point. And anything else to add? We will be also adding some of the darkest darks in this stage. That will help us kind of gauge how dark we can actually go with the graphite, since I don't have a value scale here. I'm just operating on experience now. But if you did make a value scale, which I highly recommend, you should probably tape it up next to your image so you can then compare. And because sometimes you feel like I've gone so dark already, and then you realize okay, well, we have still 2 more steps to work with in terms of tone. So you might think you're going dark, but you still have a lot of value left in the tank, so to speak. So as we did last time, I'm just going to first make sure you have the right pencil. It's the 2B. Just change the marker there. So it's 2B. I'll just start creating the tone in the areas of shadow. In tiny slivers of shadow like this area here, I probably can't, tackle it with the stubby brush because it's just too large for small shapes like this, unless I want to make a very vague sort of smudge around this whole area, which I don't, unsurprisingly. So I'll just, hatch in some tone at first. I can actually even sharpen my pencil to make sure it's a bit more even. The 2B gets a little bit dull pretty quickly. And again, we do want to sort of preserve any information we can at this stage, but it's not going to be very clean at the end of this stage. We just try to be sort of efficient about the process. And next up, this foot. You can start wherever you like, honestly. Could be also a good idea to start on the very darkest areas. That way you can sort of also use those as a reference. But since I'm probably not gonna touch these areas too much with the stubby brush, I'll just hatch these in first, just to get something that is looking dark enough. Well, I forgot to mention, of course, we're gonna tone the ground as well, so we need to figure out the value for that. It's a pretty light surface that the model is standing on. It's a light gray. I really don't see it being, you know, much darker than the figure in shadow. The figure in shadow on this model actually is quite dark. There's not a whole lot of reflected light coming in, so yeah. This looks very light on the image, but we do want to tone it down, I feel like, so we get the sort of correct, you know, value structure, let's say. We don't want to have this like a light smudgy thing when we have these halftones on the figure that might even go darker than this shadow. So this is kind of the principle of keeping your light and shadow families separate. And we do this by trying to make sure that the lightest dark is still darker than the darkest light. So even if we have something very dark in the halftone before the bedbug line, we still would like to maintain that that thing is lighter than any reflected light we have. There will be exceptions and you will learn to use those when necessary, of course, but we try to stick with that principle overall, because yeah, these principles are, you know, rules are meant to be broken is what a lot of people say, but you know, we break those rules once we fully understand why those rules are in place and how it impacts the image when we break those rules. So until you know how to do that, I recommend you really just try to stick with the sort of let's say, I guess rule is a good word for this. So they aren't rules in the sense that, you know, you get into trouble if you break them. You just end up with a, you know, less realistic feeling image, I want to say, but which is not the worst thing in the world. You're not gonna get arrested by the art police for breaking these rules. Okay, I think that's pretty much enough of shadow to sort of give a visual of her standing there in the space. So we can get rid of, we don't mind having a little bit of tone around it because we want to have it sort of fading away. Even if we see, you know, a lot of it just sort of dwindling away into the distance on the image, we don't really want to put a long ass shadow on here because that's just gonna sort of be distracting. You know, where is it going? It's just heading right out of the image. It's not really, you know, contributing to the, let's say, artwork we're creating here. This is an exercise, of course, you know, there is a lot of artistry to it, but I don't really see it as, you know, very expressive, let's say. So wherever the articulation of the shadow shapes is a little bit wonky, that would be something you should probably fix before you actually really smudge in this tone. It's always easier to see the tones in the shadows. Sorry, it's easier to see the shapes when the tones in the shadows are a little bit, you know, darker and more contrasted. The shapes become more vivid. So then you can really look for those smaller corrections here. This is not really a stage where we're meant to be correcting, but obviously, like, that's the next stage after the big form modeling. With the dark square, we correct the variation stage. That's where we want to sort of fix the shapes we lost during this and the next stage. And there's a good reason for that, but honestly, if we want to get something right on this stage, we don't, you know, accept mistakes. We fix those and then move on, as long as we notice those mistakes, of course. So if I spot something, I'm not gonna, you know, save it for a later stage. I'm just gonna fix it right now, as long as it contributes to this stage. So I'm not gonna go into the lights and fix a lot of things. Speaking of fixing things, I also, when I came back to this session, just before we forget, I just wanna slightly carve down the size of the head. We don't really care about the plumb line anymore. We have a nice looking figure in place. We can, you know, just slightly reduce the size of her head at this point if we want. So let's just go in and redraw this. So as I was saying previously, we don't really care too much about this articulation of the head. Want it to remain a distinct shape, of course, but we don't really care to have a, you know, amazing line quality around there because the hair we want to make soft regardless. If you have it very sharp all over, it's gonna look like a helmet, and that's not something we really want. So, all right, now that I slightly nudged it a bit smaller, I feel like it's looking a little bit more proportional. Yeah, let's leave it at that and keep working. So I'm starting to get a bit of sunlight on the board. I hope that doesn't mess with the lightness, or sorry, I hope it doesn't mess with the exposure too much. Again, here we're gonna just basically lose all this articulation, as I said before. So here, unless we put in a very dark and confident line on, for example, the shin area here, we're gonna, you know, lose that nice sharp edge quality we wanted in the articulation. But we're gonna go in and maybe reinforce that if necessary in the variation stage. So as you can see, I'm just coloring in this whole area with the pencil. I don't really care about this contour at all here. If we need some separation, we can go in the variations of the dark stage and put some in. But since it's pretty indistinct in the image, I don't really see why I should. You know, having lost edges and this kind of stuff just creates a bit more atmosphere and realism, honestly, because your eye doesn't pick up on all these things in real life either. So, and whenever you lose something like this, you can just think, you know, I found it once, how hard can it be to find it again? You know, already had a practice round, so don't be too precious. Also, this shadow on the finger is just gonna connect to this shadow shape. We like having stuff like this where, you know, separate shapes connect to each other. So this is one of the more tedious stages in this whole drawing process, but it is pretty efficient. You know, you could scrub around the image slightly, drawing and darkening things pretty much forever. You know, we're talking hours before you could reach this level of darkness. And we take, you know, perhaps half an hour of active work to do this. Maybe for me it takes a little bit longer because I'm yapping away all the time. So I think I just want to reinforce these lines here as well. Should probably just grab this, just get those in the right sort of value range. These things are easy to forget. Again, we're just gonna make these darker, and we're gonna model around those anyway, so we don't really care too much. We just want them to be a little bit darker, and we're nowhere near as dark as we can go yet. One way you can check is just underneath the Underneath the feet, for example, let me just resharpen a little bit. Underneath the feet, we can put one of our darkest darks at this point already, just for demonstration's sake, where we can really just push in the graphite to its maximum value, basically. Here I'm actually applying force with the pencil. So we can see there's a distinct difference between these two values, even though it looked dark at first, but it doesn't really look as dark anymore. Under this foot we can put a little bit of that sort of ambient occlusion as well. We don't need to make it razor sharp, we can always just work it a little bit in there so it looks natural. Yeah, this is the way we know our darks are dark enough. I think these feet are pretty okay in terms of value. Probably these are on the lighter side of things, but we'll just keep it there for now, see if we need to darken those. The reason we want to darken these enough is that the form can turn. Also, the higher contrast, of course, gives the image as a whole a bit more pop. It just, you know, looks more vivid, I want to say, for lack of a better word. Okay, let's keep working this shadow value. Again, the hand area probably not going to be touching too much with the stubby brush because that's just a little bit risky, you know. I just told you that if you found it once, you can find it again, but you don't really have to be silly about it. You know, obviously you can say things that took you a bunch of time to find. Not like this hand took me an extensive amount of time, but it's probably like the single hardest thing on this image to draw well. So let's just not lose all of that information I put in earlier with the stump. This is obviously a little bit darker than this knee area. Even before the stump came into action. These will darken a little bit with the stubby brush. Suppose I could have reinforced the articulation a little bit more, since I'm pretty much losing it pretty quickly, so maybe I'll just try to take that tone in a clean way to the edge first and then fill this in. Probably here I'm gonna apply the stubby brush a little bit, or the stump, you know, to turn the form away from the shadow. Again, here we can lose this edge that we created before. We don't need that when we have two shadows on the figure melding together. As I said before, it just creates a more convincing illusion when we have things also being lost at times. Okay, just looking at this, I think I want to go a little bit darker on this initial pass already, on the knee area especially. So that means I'm just going to darken the whole shape a little bit. We're looking for average tone here. So if I find a large area like this is darker overall, then probably I just want to darken it at this point and darken most of the things along with it, including this part of the leg that is in there. Sorry, the shadow is gonna get a bit more intense as I work because, as I said, there's a little bit of light coming in from the window. I don't have a north-facing window, which is what many artists look for. which means I get direct sunlight on my easel part of the day, especially closer to summer like this. It is April as I'm working on this. So. Okay. Losing a little bit of the finger there, but perhaps we honestly don't mind too much. We can always find it back, but just try to keep things, you know, reasonably clean at this stage. So yeah, maybe I'm happy with these tones. Now this is a little bit darker as an area than this shin area. The shin is getting some reflected light, and as such it's probably anyways going to be a little bit lighter than this knee area. These ankle shadows could be a little bit darker though, because they're not getting too much reflected light, being that they face upwards, so probably close to none. They might be a bit darker. Also, we're gonna tone the entire feet in the upcoming stage of movement of tone and fall of light. So we're gonna lose a little bit of this contrast already during that stage. So it doesn't matter too much if we darken these a little bit on the heavier side. Might be helpful, in fact. All right, let's look for something to tone in. Let's just maybe put in this shadow on the neck over here. Again, trying to retain the shape. My pencil's getting quite dull again. It's hard to remain in those smaller shapes. I can find myself smudging around a little bit too much. So just sharpen your pencil whenever you start feeling it's not working for you anymore. If you feel it's working against you, then of course it's time to fix that thing. There's not a whole lot of reflected light, you know. Maybe a place where it could be catching a little bit is just the top of the trapezius over here, but I don't think that's really happening too much. Okay, let's just focus on figure in shadow first. Just tackle this area over here. We don't really care too much about the articulation on this shadow either, because, you know, hair moves. We could just decide on a shape, whichever we think looks the best if we're working in a figure class. Also, we're gonna lose this edge anyways because we're intentionally gonna soften it quite a bit. I think the shadow comes down slightly lower and slightly further away from the hair. Oh yeah, it's also a pretty dark shadow here because it's a cast shadow cast by the hair, which is dark. It sort of absorbs a lot of the light. There's probably not much passing through the clump of hair. And as such, you know, it's very dark as well. It's very close to the point it's casting the shadow to, so there's not much ambient light coming in either. So it is quite dark, honestly. Okay, and as I said before, the very next thing we're gonna do is probably, well, not quite yet, but we're gonna lose this shape in a moment anyway, but we can just sort of use this point in time to sort of memorize that shape, and we can always, of course, look at the reference we have, because then we're gonna just mass in this hair at pretty much the same value. but maybe we can first work on the figure in shadow. Let's just connect this shadow shape on the neck into the face area. Looks super weird at this point, but since we're gonna darken the hair afterwards, it's gonna look like the value relationship is correct. Here on the face, I think I'll intentionally leave it a little bit lighter because, as we said before, the halftone on here that we're kind of treating as a shadow for now, because that's just more, it's super dark as a halftone, but there is a little bit of light striking her cheek over here from the behind. So, but it's a teeny amount. It's not impacting the value of the area too much. So in my opinion, it's probably easier to just tackle it as a shadow, but let's leave the average value for that shadow a little bit lighter. So the general rule of thumb is, of course, the higher you go up a figure, the darker the shadows usually will be, because it tends to be that the ground plane, of course, is the thing that is reflecting the light rays back into the figure. Of course, down here next to the ground, it's gonna be lighter in the shadows because the intensity of this reflected light is a lot greater. You know, the further away we get from the ground, the intensity of the light falls off pretty quickly, and might be that we don't see almost any reflected lights anymore, especially on a photograph. The thing to consider, of course, is that the figure itself is reflective. You know, the skin does reflect a little bit. You can see highlight on the skin, you know, in places, for example, on the forearm on the figure, there is a highlight over here, you can see. So yeah, the figure will reflect lights onto itself, onto herself in this case, not itself. So, you know, you just have to keep in mind, maybe this shoulder, if it was very, I guess, extended and round and all this stuff, it might be actually reflecting a little bit of light into the shadow of her face. Might be partly what's going on, might be a halftone. But yeah, then again, on her breast over here, probably nothing is gonna reflect because it's very much, you know, obscured by her body and it's very far away from the ground, so there's probably not gonna be much over there. In places where there's two things that meet, usually the shadow between them might be a little bit lighter, as you could see over here on the reference, because the light is hitting her hand and it's reflecting right back into the sort of little crevice that's in there. So it's a bit lighter in this crevice rather than, you know, just the shadow over here. Okay, enough about that, but that's just a note to take into account. Okay, so we'll leave the face a little bit lighter. Maybe I'll just even it out a little bit so we get a nicer tone there. And maybe I can just reinforce the outlines a little bit to sort of reinforce the portrait. It's not much of a portrait, but there is a portrait. It's like a reversed 3/4 view. I think we're seeing pretty, it's not a side profile, it's slightly from the back. Honestly, with the hair, I think I'll just mask it in with the tone first. I'll just create a little bit of a separation over here, since it's gonna fall into shadow before it hits the face. As we do want it to be sort of round as well, we can treat the hair as just a form, you know, that's turning also. So now let's just mask things in. We keep in mind the placement of these shadow edges we found already, but I think it's gonna be easier to just sort of tone everything in evenly and then find the darkest spots. Also, we don't really mind the direction that we're hatching because we're just gonna smoosh it together anyway. If you don't plan to use tools, you might want to pay a bit more attention to the direction of your strokes, might create a nice visual feeling. It's not really dark enough yet. It's pretty close, slightly darker only than the shadow of the face, so just make it slightly darker. Oh yeah, right now we just want to find contrast. Again, I start to feel that I need to push my pencil a little bit harder to reach the correct value. Means I'm just not working with a sharp enough pencil. Usually it means that it's becoming so dull that it can't reach any of the sort of smaller cracks on the surface. So sort of gliding over those, and it leaves a lot of light marks. Doesn't really get dark as you would expect. So in that case, the remedy is just sharpening your pencil as always. Especially with stages like this, you really go through pencils quite a lot. So I recommend you get some spares handy. As I said, probably in the previous video, I recommend you have at least maybe 3 2B pencils sharpened at all times, since in a stage like this, you just go through all of those basically, and you might drop one of those by accident or something, and then all of a sudden you spend half the session sharpening pencils as opposed to drawing, which is also why this mechanical lead holder thing is quite a lifesaver. Not literally. it's a time saver, not a lifesaver. All right, that's good enough for the tones on the hair, but now we want to re-establish the shadows on the hair. So we have the form that is defined by the main mass of the hair, but then there's the smaller shape for the bangs. So let's just go in and redefine these lighter areas by darkening things around them. That's the best way. As you can see, we can go still quite a bit darker. So, and this value still is, you know, a good step away from the darkest darks we're going to be putting in. So we'll be using a bit of that darkest value on the hair as well. Again, we can just sort of conceptualize a sphere-like shape for the head here. Of course, it's very round as a shape, so we can just, even if we don't see a very, you know, clear and distinct bedbug line on the hair, because the values of the darker turning tones in the lights of the hair are so dark that it's just so hard to distinguish between the shadow of the hair and those turning tones, like create the line. It becomes a very soft transition. It's something we're gonna have over here, but right now we just wanna sort of establish the shadow value for this hair, so we don't really mind that. As you can see, now it's very distinctly darker than this area. We will tackle that later. Perhaps we could have gone even darker with the figurine shadow, but we'll just smudge things together now with the stubby brush and then see where we are at. And also, yeah, this smudging with the stubby brush, as I stated probably in the bark demo, I can't remember, it makes things darker than they are actually initially, because unlike the stump, this brush doesn't really lift off the graphite, it just sort of pushes it into the paper. And the paper consists of, this fine texture. All those little white points on the paper, they raise the average value of that area. And when we push the graphite into those cracks, the average value for that area decreases, so it gets a little bit darker. These smaller areas, I'm just being really careful and just using the corner of the brush to very gently sort of mush things around a little bit. I'm not going crazy with this, giving it a very light treatment, let's say. In here we can be a bit rougher. As I'm smushing this, I'm already thinking about it sort of softening a little bit towards the penumbra area, but we'll leave it at that. That's for the variations, but if we can, we of course want to sort of think ahead. In a way, this procedure for creating these drawings and paintings, it's just a good sort of solid way to approach these things. But obviously the purpose is to create, nice and finished artworks in the end. So, these steps serve a purpose for you to follow very clear sort of steps. But once you master them, of course, you'll start to be able to skip these steps in part and, keep the ones that you feel are useful. Just trying to keep the shapes a bit clean for now, so we don't get, too mushy all over. I recommend you take a bit of care with areas where there's some fine drawing, so you don't just lose everything. It's very easy for all of the drawing to start looking like this, it becomes a cotton ball instead of a drawing. Also, that's the reason I'm using the pencil to fill in the shapes rather than picking up graphite powder and applying with the brush. It's way more controlled. I can sort of skip a whole new stage of, going over the entire drawing and erasing the outlines back, So I think this overall saves us a bit of effort, even though toning in with the brush and the graphite powder would very likely be faster in getting to this value. But faster in that stage would mean an extra stage, basically, so I'm not convinced it's worth it. My teacher Davide told me they tried it at the school once, but then, all the drawings started looking like cotton balls, so they sort of reverted back. Okay, let's just tone this whole thing in. Sorry, scrub this in. Yeah, this is gonna be a little bit too light, this heron light overall. Probably gonna have to take another pass at it. This heron shadow probably is pretty alright, but we'll see in a moment. So what we have for the heron light now is probably closer to the sort of highlight value that we see in the image itself, not really an average stone, so we should really darken this whole area. But let's just finish the other areas before that. So now that we have sort of toned everything in, we can ask the question, are we dark enough? And how we can find out, of course, is making sure that we have our darkest dark on the paper. We have two bits over here that are pretty much as dark as the pencil goes, but they're, very small areas. It's hard to compare against, really. So we can just maybe look for some other areas where there could be the darkest dark. So one thing where this hair kind of folds onto itself into the shadow, maybe behind the bangs layer a little bit. There probably is a very dark spot over here. So we can see there's a pretty distinct value difference, so maybe we need to actually darken these things further. Also, this tool is sort of a very used pencil. It has basically a rounded off tip, so you can really just kind of burnish the graphite into that paper. It does leave a shiny surface if you really look into it, but when you use it in very small areas, it doesn't really glare. You know, if I were to tone in the entirety of the head with this, you know, it would look horrible. It would, you know, be burnished and shiny as opposed to very dark. But in select few places, you know, this really pushes the drawing to a next level. So maybe we can leave that there just as a reminder. Maybe we could see something as dark as that in here in this sort of occlusion shadow, but we don't want to put that in there because we really don't want maybe this dark crease in the middle of the lightest area of the form. One place we could consider here, though with a finer pencil, just checking if we could sort of place a little bit of a darker tone in here where the finger stops and the palm is hitting the thigh. It's going to be a pretty occlusion-y area as it's in the shadow. The light is reflecting a little bit onto the thigh here. We see the shadow is a little bit lighter, and on the picture it's a bit more high in chroma, it's a bit more orangey in color. But you know, where this area sort of actually touches the thigh, it's gonna leave a little bit of a dark occlusion shadow always. It's pretty much always gonna happen when things touch. So judging by these, maybe we honestly need to just give it another pass, darken everything slightly, and then move from there. But first we're gonna take a break. Okay, looking at this figure now, I'm not entirely convinced we need to darken all of the shadows, but let's at least darken the hair and the cast shadow on the back. So let's just give it another pass. And what I'm just aiming to do here is just evenly give it a slightly darker tone. And as I've said previously on the bark demo, this is a step where I honestly recommend you take down the drawing and just do it on a table or your lap. It's just much more ergonomical and easy when you can just rotate the picture on the table as you need and, you know, reach every place comfortably while you're doing this. But for obvious filming reasons, I'm not gonna do that. Otherwise you'll miss all of this. So. Or I would have to reset my camera to another setup, so no thank you. For the hair in shadow, let's just try to get super dark. As dark as we can get with a pencil without actually like damaging or burnishing the paper so it doesn't start shining on us too much. One way to prevent that is just do multiple passes and with a very sharp pencil so we don't get that sheen as much. Also, when you're trying to evenly darken something, you can look for these lighter spots already in the dark tone and color those in, and that will create a more even sensation of the tone. Maybe we can go back in and just smoosh this around a little bit. When it's, you know, to the very maximum, of the amounts of graphite that we can apply, then at that point we start approaching the place where this actually won't darken things anymore and might actually lighten it a little bit. So because this thing is quite saturated with graphite, but it can still, you know, lift graphite off places where there's less graphite, I mean more graphite on the paper than there is graphite sort of stuck to the brush already. So in these very saturated graphite places we can get that situation. Okay, we can, you know, go darker in places in the variation stage, but I think this is plenty good for the Big 4 modeling stage. Yeah. I'm just having another look so we don't have to change things anymore. Well, honestly, we could use a little bedbug line here. I'll just sort of reinforce the bedbug line a little bit darker, because that would sort of ensure that we don't have to re-render things many times. The reason we're going dark enough is because when we Big 4 model, voila, now it's turning, we add some tones over here, we make a nice transition. Then once we have that transition, we probably shouldn't touch this bedbug line anymore, too much at least, in terms of value, because then if we then go and darken, we'll have another dark line and the 4 modeling doesn't work anymore. So basically we'll just be doing the step for nothing. So that's why I'm being a bit picky here, you know, about the value. I'm just pushing it on the edge here. I'm not gonna darken the entire shadow area because it's not necessary for me to have it super flat. I just want to have this edge where we're going to be modeling the form a little bit darker, around the tone I see on there. It doesn't have to be any darker than that, of course. All right, so I think that's it for this stage.